Factors surrounding this devastating natural disaster. We joined in the studio by Dr. Herman Van Niekerk from the Department of Geology at the University of Johannesburg. Good morning to you and thanks for coming.
It's a big pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, in a situation like this where a country has experienced an earthquake just in 3 weeks' time and another one, how do you describe this in geological terms?
Well, what you have to keep in mind, first of all, is the reason why this whole earthquake has actually happened. And as the listeners and the viewers might know, it is because the Indian plate is being pushed in below the Asian plate. You know, we deal with this process of plate tectonics that shapes our world as we know it. And this movement of the Indian plate underneath the Eurasian plate is along what we as geologists refer to a thrust fault. And along this, the rocks are sticking. Okay? So with time, pressure is building up, and that is obviously what gives rise to the Himalayan mountain belts, all of this pushing of these two old continents next to each other. And at some point, things have to break. And when it breaks, that's when we've got an earthquake. And what happened yesterday is that along that same thrust fault, because of the earthquake 3 years ago, there is now instability. And nature is trying to reset everything to a low, stability, or zone of instability, and that's why there's more earthquakes along this old, fault line.
So in that scenario, are you able to experience sporadic seismic events, even when it's not like massive?
Yes, there is continuous seismic events at the moment, and in actual fact, that part of the world is a very seismically active part of the world. And there's been large earthquakes in the past, but a long time ago, so the stresses have been building up for quite a while. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's another large earthquake in the next couple of weeks. So
what causes these? And I hear there's another term called, if we're not talking about seismic events, we talk about aftershocks. What is this event at the moment?
This event of yesterday is a new earthquake, okay? The smaller earthquakes associated with that is what we refer to as an aftershock. It's a little bit long, the time difference between the two, to call this an aftershock after the earthquake of 3 weeks ago. But there will be lots of smaller earthquakes as well as everything resettles after the Earth's crust has moved in this event.
Now, in a situation like this, are we able to have prior warning?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer. Geologists have been trying to do this all over the world for a very long time. But the Earth is an incredibly big system. All we can do is we could try and measure the stresses in the Earth's crust. And there's certain places in the world that we know large earthquakes are imminent, like for instance Istanbul in Turkey. But it's extremely difficult to say that it will happen tomorrow or in 10 years' time. We just know that it's going to happen at some time. And in the case of Nepal, a week before the first large earthquake that happened, now there was actually a big gathering of scientists and emergency workers in Nepal where they actually discussed preparations for the big earthquake that was coming. So at the moment we can't predict it.
Well, I would imagine a country like Nepal having beautiful buildings, such, architectural finesse in as far as the construction of their buildings is concerned. Now, tell me about the structural integrity of the buildings that are there. How were they designed to cope with such disasters?
Unfortunately, Nepal, again, is one of these places in the world which is, quite poor. There's not a lot of money. So buildings are not built to withstand earthquakes. Mainly mud buildings, mud brick buildings and so forth. There's not the funding or the technology available like what you would have in Tokyo, in Japan, to prepare earthquakes against buildings like this, or in the United States. And a lot of these buildings are obviously very old. And, it's very interesting why sometimes these buildings withstand previous earthquakes, but they are not strong and they're not constructed to withstand earthquakes.
Now going forward with technology innovation, how can the situation be improved so that when there's such a disaster, perhaps the approach can be different to save lives, to also look at the country that it doesn't regress in its development?
Well, that's a difficult thing. The rich countries in the world need to not only supply money, but also supply engineers and so forth that can work on these problems and preparing the country, especially if they have to rebuild quite a lot, that the buildings that is built after an event like this, is constructed in such a manner. And it's going to cost a lot of money to do things like that, and it's going to involve a lot of clever people that need to go there. And that's one of the big problems we have in the world, that because of the world's population is getting larger and larger all the time, there's more and more people living in places where they actually shouldn't be living. So it's a big social economic dilemma that the world is facing, with poor countries in tectonically active areas and how you would get them to prepare for earthquake events.
Now, in a situation where it's such a mountainous area, what happens during the earthquakes? Are we having threats of volcanic eruptions?
Not in this case. Not in the case of Nepal. We're dealing there what we as geologists refer to as two continents that are colliding, a continental collisional zone. There's no earthquakes, volcanoes close by, or no, magma that will transform into lava on the surface. That's very different when you go to places like Japan, which is sitting on different plate tectonic settings, different plate tectonic boundaries. It's all a very interesting subject. And in those cases, the volcanic activity is directly associated with the movement of the plates that also result in earthquakes. But in the case of Nepal, that is not the case.
Now look at the cascading down effect. It now overlaps onto India, onto Tibet, China. How does it unfold?
Well, it's because this specific zone where the earthquake now occurred, this Himalayan mountain range, is just part of a much larger mountain range. It stretches all the way, through Pakistan up into Turkey and eventually even connects with the Alps in Europe, where continents are colliding. So there might be more earthquakes in China, in Mongolia, and India, all along this same zone, because this zone is not just, located in Nepal. It stretches over a huge area of the Asian subcontinent.
Now, looking at the level of literacy, how do you think the government approaches the forewarnings and evacuation of residents when there is such a seismic activity?
The problem you have, first of all, is infrastructure, like you rightly said. The infrastructure doesn't really exist to warn people very quickly. But the second thing is, even if you were to know, and I've read somewhere that people have said that there was supposed to be technology available that could give people a 30-second warning. I mean, what would a 30-second warning, unfortunately, help people? So it's a huge dilemma, and it's also a dilemma of warning people for smaller earthquakes, and eventually people get despondent and they don't react. And when the big earthquake happens, people just don't react to it anymore. So it's also a very complex issue. Again, it's a social issue and an economic issue.
Now, what's your view regarding the current situation? My understanding, as we hear reports coming, is that people who are really galvanized into action to help with relief operations for people who are destitute, they don't have access to water and other amenities and such. But then the government is only concentrating on stricter protocols in as far as access to areas. I mean, I've been speaking to one of the spokesperson of one of the relief organizations who's saying it's very difficult to access areas because of the red tape.
Now, that's a difficult question to answer. I'm not really sure why and how this is. But it might be, for various reasons. They might feel from the government side that certain areas are not completely safe, and therefore they also don't want to endanger people that actually come and help. The big problem we often have in rescue situations is that the rescuers become themselves people that needs to be rescued. So that's the only reason why I could think this is happening.
Mm-hmm. Now, going forward, what is it that you think the Nepalese government can do? I understand there are relief operations, countries are willing to help out. But then given that the government finds itself in a quagmire, so to say, going forward, what should really happen?
I think going forward, they should make sure that when they rebuild, they employ much stricter regulations regarding structures and buildings to make them more earthquake safe, because they are living in an earthquake prone area, and it's going to happen again. It's going to maybe happen in a couple of weeks' time, a couple of years' time, in a decade's time. But as long as they live there, they've got to prepare themselves for the inevitable. And if you live in a zone like this, you've got to prepare. So I think from the Nepalese government side, that's what they have to look into, is when they start rebuilding now, doing it in such a way that will make everything a lot safer for the people that actually live there.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Big pleasure.
All right, I'm speaking here to Dr. Herman Van Niekerk from the Department of Geology at the University of Johannesburg, talking to us right here on AM News. We're going to take a